how hard should we hit our crashes? Should we hit every cymbal the same way? Well, today we're going to find out how to get the best possible sound out of every cymbal on your kit. Hey everybody, welcome to The Non-Glamorous Drummer. Be sure to hit that subscribe button if you're new to the channel. Now let's jump on down to the kit. Really, there are two sides to this discussion. We're talking about striking velocity, like how hard we're physically going to hit the cymbals, but also the resulting volume. So what's the desired volume that we want from the cymbals? So how do those two relate? How hard should we hit them? What should our volumes be? So first we're going to talk about striking velocity. So that's where we're kind of just talking about physics and how the weight and the size of the cymbal affect how we should be hitting it. First, I'd like to do sort of an extreme comparison, striking an 8-inch splash versus a 21-inch medium ride. So this is the Zildjian A Sweet Ride. This is the Zildjian A Splash, just the A Splash 8-inch. So tiny, really lightweight cymbal versus pretty big, pretty heavy cymbal. How should we strike these differently, whether or not we're laying the stick into it or glancing the stick off? Really, the big difference here is that the cymbal is so small and lightweight and moves so easily that we could pretty much hit it as hard as we want to, even at a relatively sharp angle, and it's not going to hurt the cymbal. That's one big thing with cymbals. You want to make sure that you're not hitting at too sharp of an angle. Like if I were to hit this cymbal here really hard at this angle straight on, that's not good for the cymbal. We're potentially going to dent the edge, or it could even crack over time. And it's also, it doesn't sound as good that way because you're getting a lot more attack and impact to the stick. You're also going to chip up your stick more. So most of the time we want to be hitting at a more gradual angle. Down here on the ride, well, this is a much bigger cymbal that's going to move less when we hit it. So we can play around with hitting it here or here, and whether or not we're soft or quiet, either way kind of works. It just depends on what sound we want. So it's almost like with the splash, in order to get a full splash sound, we've got to hit that hard. With the ride, it all depends on what kind of sound we're going for. But with the splash, I don't think a quiet splash kind of sound is much appealing. Now let's do a less extreme comparison. We'll look at an 18-inch, pretty thin, dark crash versus a 20-inch, heavier, medium-ish A crash. So we're going to be looking at a K-Custom dark 18-inch crash right here versus the 20-inch A crash. So weight-wise, these cymbals, I mean, they both got some weight to them, but this one is definitely heavier, definitely the thicker cymbal. It's going to be the more bright metallic sounding cymbal, whereas this one's going to be a little bit darker, but it's going to have some nice shimmer to it. So we're going to compare these side by side. How might we need to strike them differently to get an optimum sound? These are actually fairly similar in feel, even with this one being a good bit bigger. They both crash pretty quickly, they respond well. But in terms of how hard we hit them, really we can approach both of these the same way, where it has less to do with how hard we're hitting, but more the manner that we're hitting. That's really the more important thing to look at here. We're still using that glancing motion, and I'm probably hitting about this far up the stick. With a thicker, bigger cymbal like this, I'm okay with sliding up a little bit further, really laying into it, more stick. Whereas with a thinner, smaller cymbal, it works fine to hit it more about right here. That does depend on whether or not we're washing on it, like riding on it. Let's do a little of that for comparison too. So there again, really we can take the same approach with crashing on these, where if we're continually crashing like that over and over again, it makes the most sense really to be closer to the end of the stick, just because it gives us more control and the cymbal responds better that way. And so we can do the same thing with both of these. I think any crash that's probably bigger than 16 inches, 16 or bigger, we can approach the same way, where we've got to lay into it the same way, but we're also glancing the stick off. So that energy from the stick is being transferred back out rather than into the cymbal, because that's what could potentially crack a cymbal. What we don't want to do is go bury the cymbal or bury the stick in the cymbal. It's not like we're doing like karate trying to slice wood. We're not trying to slice a crack in the cymbal here. We're just bouncing off. And so that's a general rule for all cymbals, really. So now let's jump into the more interesting part of this, which is how loud should we be hitting the drums in relation to how loud we're hitting the cymbals, and how might these different types of cymbals compare. First, what I'd like to do is play a couple different grooves on the thicker cymbal. So we're going to put the 20-inch crash right up here. We're going to put the 21-inch ride. So these are both the A cymbals, 21-inch ride right here. And so I'm going to play a really light, pretty quiet groove, incorporating both of these cymbals, and then I'm going to play a really heavy, really loud groove, and then we'll do the same with the Ks, and we'll talk about the differences in the way these cymbals reacted. Okay, so differences there between the different types of cymbals. There are definitely some huge differences. I really like the feel of the A's when I'm playing really loud. I like how it's just really fun to crash on those. I like how they're pretty stable cymbals because they're heavier. I can be laying into that 20-inch crash up here, and it's not really swinging around much, whereas this one is going to swing a little bit more. So I have to make sure I'm really staying consistent in my velocity to keep the cymbal from swinging back and forth. For loud playing and hitting pretty hard, as long as the stick is glancing off, we can really lay into those A's. And we can do the same with the K's. We can really lay into the K's. But it's very important with these thinner cymbals that are more prone to swinging around, it's very important that we're glancing the stick off and playing closer to the end rather than too far up, because then the cymbals start moving around, and when they do, we start to get a less consistent sound. So that's something to be aware of with cymbals like this. When you start hitting them really hard, you just got to make sure that you're keeping kind of a swiping motion just to keep the cymbals from getting into that sort of thing. Whereas with the heavier cymbals, you don't have to worry about that as much. With the heavier cymbals, you can really lay into them even further up the stick, and they're probably not going to swing a whole lot. However, you saw when I was playing really quietly that, you know, the A's were okay for that. They're all right for the quiet playing. But I don't like how even when I hit the A crash lightly, it rings out for a long time. I feel like it needs to die a little bit quicker. It's also not a great sounding crash at a light volume. So that's where really to get a full crash sound out of a heavier cymbal like with the A's, you've got to hit them harder. And in a small room, sometimes you can only hit them so hard. And if I were playing in a really small room with sticks, I wouldn't have wanted to hit that crash any harder than I hit it a minute ago. But when I switched over to the K's, I felt like I was able to get a slightly better crash sound just hitting this one like this. There's a good bit of stick attack. There's a lot of that initial stick attack and not so much of the cymbal swell. Whereas when you hit it really hard, should have put my in-ears back in for that. That was loud. When you hit it really hard, you get a lot more of the cymbal swell in relation to that stick impact. But it's safe to say with a thinner cymbal, you're going to get more of the quality cymbal body, cymbal swell sound without having to hit them as hard. Optimum cymbal striking volume for the K's, I think, is a little bit quieter than with the A's. It all depends on cymbal, it depends on genre, it depends on style, it depends on room you're playing in. Most important thing here is to analyze your cymbals, experiment, listen to them. If you can record yourself, that is the best, that is ideal. It's felt like an open-ended discussion here where there's not a single, here's how hard you should hit your crashes. There's a lot of variables. And so my goal today has just been to introduce to you, make sure you're aware of all those variables and the things that can affect that so you're thinking about it so that as you practice, as you play gigs and record yourself, you'll get a better and better feel for how hard you ought to be hitting your cymbals. Hey, I hope this video helped you out. If you enjoyed the video and you're new to the channel and you haven't yet subscribed, be sure to do so before you go. Until next time, take care, guys. I'll see you next week.